We made this.
Welcome to the Starlight Ballroom. Hey!
Hello and welcome to Shipwrecked and COMATOSE, the podcast about Red Dwarf here on the We Made This podcast network. My name is Mark Adams and I am your host for this episode. And it is a bit of a spiritual sequel to an episode from last year where I brought on two international Red Dwarf fans to talk about their experience about watching Red Dwarf and accessing Red Dwarf. And I've got them both back for a chat about two wonderful anomaly type situations that I wasn't even aware of until I met these guys. But we'll talk about what we're talking about in a minute. I'm just going to welcome back Devon Rowcliffe. Hello, Devon.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
And welcome back to Vinnk, or as I'm going to call you, Kevin.
Well, that is my name. So thank you very much for having me on. Really had a fun time the last time and looking forward to it again.
Excellent. So we had a chat about the international experiences previously. And during that conversation, it was Devon that brought up two things that, I'd never even heard of PBS. Is it PBS?
Yep,
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, I'd never even heard of that, let alone these PBS specials. So we're going to do two episodes over the next 2 weeks, looking at the two episodes. Are we calling them episode specials? Weird things exist as a thing. Swirly Thing Alert and Smegheads in Seattle. This week we're looking at Swirly Thing Alert. Devon, do you want to kind of explain what the fuck it is we're actually talking about?
Okay. So as you mentioned, PBS is a television network in the USA, and many North Americans, including Canadians, first encountered Red Dwarf through watching on PBS. Public Broadcasting Service, I think it stands for.
Service.
Our system? Okay.
Oh,
System
one of those.
Survey? One of those.
Yeah.
So each individual station on PBS would technically be independent, but part of the network. And when the Red Dwarf cast members would go overseas to promote a new series of Red Dwarf, they would often go to Seattle. It was considered a major PBS hub because they devoted a lot of time and attention to Red Dwarf. And so in 1997 and 98, when crew members went out, or cast members, I should say, went out to help promote Red Dwarf, the Seattle PBS decided they would actually film the cast members mucking about around in Seattle and all the hijinks they got up to. So there's interviews, there's convention clips, there's all sorts of different little curios in these episodes.
Yeah, and I learned quite a few little tidbits, actually. There was stuff that obviously, I've been doing this podcast a long time that I knew. But there were a few little bits and bobs in the Q&As that I thought, bloody hell, that's fascinating. But before we talk about that, I think just very, very briefly, let's do a quick intro about who you both are to remind people. We're not going to do the officer's exam, but just very quickly, Devon, introduce people to who you are.
Okay, I'm Devon Rowcliffe, live in Canada, started watching Red Dwarf roughly in 1994. I work as a writer now. Does that about cover it?
Yeah, that'll do. And Kevin, what about yourself?
Well, I'm originally from Wisconsin in the United States. I live in Japan. I guess I'm a teacher. I do a little bit of writing. I've got a podcast of my own about television called Two Boobs Watch the Tube.
It's a great name, that.
Yeah, I thought so.
Brilliant. So are we ready to talk about this week's topic of Swirly Thing Alert?
Definitely.
Swirly Thing Alert.
So Swirly Thing Alert was broadcast on PBS exclusively between Series 6 and Series 7 of Red Dwarf. So it was interesting in as much as, I think last time you mentioned, Devon, that there was a big wait between 5 and 6 over in the States, which wasn't the case in the UK.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we both mentioned that we were most familiar with series 1 through 5, and we did see series 6 eventually, but it sounded like both Kevin and I were most familiar with 1 through 5. Yes.
Yeah, it took a while for Series 6 to get there. I don't know if it was something with the different rights or whatever, but I watched it on videotapes before it ever hit the PBS stations. I mean, I had heard about it, and the internet was around back then. It was like Usenet and things like that. It was, what was it? rec.arts.Red Dwarf, I think, was the channel to go
Wow.
to talk about it. And so I'd heard a lot about it, but I hadn't actually seen it until I think the videotape versions of it came out before it ever actually hit the airwaves.
Were these legal or illegal videotape versions?
I was able to acquire, I believe, Byte 2, I think they were called back then, or whatever, legally. And then a friend of mine had made me a copy of Byte 1. So both, I guess.
And I have a vivid memory of recording a marathon. The PBS, or at least in Seattle, They would usually marathon over a weekend, all the episodes. And I have vivid memories of knowing that Series 6 had been available in the UK, expecting it to be shown, setting the recorder, the VCR, to record all the episodes, going out, coming back, checking it, not seeing Series 6, thinking I screwed up somehow and being furious. Having to wait another year or two to see it, but I suspect that it just hadn't come out yet in North America.
Yeah. These marathons, I mean, that's really common for PBS, especially during like pledge drive season, where they're trying to get people to donate to the. You see, these networks are all like they're funded by the public, but unlike the BBC, which takes like a television license, it's mostly voluntary. Some businesses and corporations donate, but like. Most of their funding, is it most of their funding? A lot of their funding comes from what they say is viewers like you.
I think even watching the very, very limited stuff of PBS I've already seen, which is essentially these two videos that we're looking at, the amount of viewers like you, it's almost like a catchphrase.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like they use.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
And these are fascinating. We definitely didn't get these in the UK. I can't see how we would have even heard about these things. It's like you say, the internet was in just its infancy.
Yeah.
And things like this are on various Red Dwarf fan sites and things like that now. And I'm sure British fans, if you're into Red Dwarf enough, will have heard of them and probably watched them. But at the time, we absolutely wouldn't have got access to this. And it's actually kind of a shame. I think I would have really liked to have seen this at the time. With hindsight, watching it now, it's not as cool as it would have been at the time. But I think at the time, it would have been something really cool to access. Did you feel like you'd got something special, something exclusive that you knew the Brits didn't have? Or was that not really something on your radar?
I think it was on our radar that this was just going to be local. And indeed, it wasn't just on the locality. It wasn't just PBS. I think it was actually just specifically the Seattle PBS that had access to this. It's possible that this could have gone out on one or two other PBS stations, but I think this was only shown in Seattle. So it absolutely was quite exclusive.
It was my first time to see it. Now, I'd seen other pledge drives or whatever for Wisconsin Public Television. I know they did a pledge drive where not actually bringing them to the States, but they got Doctor Who actors and actresses to record little in-between bits. There's the one with like the Seventh Doctor and Ace standing outside the TARDIS going, "What's the best thing about going to Wisconsin, Ace?" It's like, "Oh, I'd say it's watching Doctor Who on PBS and the station identification stuff."
So fucking corny.
It was it's so bad. But like, so a lot of the tapes that I'd watched of these shows were taped during these pledge drives. So they had these little bits and pieces in between where they bring up the things like, if you donate this certain amount of money. Originally, the only way you could get the Smegups videotape was by donating to PBS.
Right.
It was available as an exclusive for a long time before they actually put it as a mass market release.
And there were also those sort of relatively generic, but also slightly localized clips that were filmed by the Red Dwarf cast members. And
That's right.
think if you watch, I think it's DVD Series 8, if you look at the extras, I think they have a lot of those PBS clips.
Oh, I'm going to check those out. Okay.
I think a lot of these things are unfortunately lost. I do another podcast about Chucky, the killer doll, the TV series, etc. We wanted to look at it's gone out of fashion, but it's like an old thing where you phoned up a premium phone line to get a conversation with Chucky or Freddy Krueger or WWE wrestlers or whatever.
Yep.
And a lot of the WWE ones, the Freddy one is still around, but I just don't think it exists anymore, the Chucky one, which is a real shame. And I think stuff like this, we're kind of lucky if people have randomly still got it and stick it on YouTube, because there's a lot of stuff out there that I would love to see as a curiosity.
Oh, yeah.
That I'm never going to get to see.
Yeah, there are websites out there like the Internet Archive that their sole mission now is to collect all these obscure curios and to put them online. But it's relatively new. Most people don't know about it. So even if they do have something that they could upload or donate to this archive, they're probably not even aware of it, sadly. But it's more and more of these things are being collected now. But yeah, 20 years ago, there was no way people were thinking about, I need to preserve this for the future.
Well, exactly.
And you talked about Doctor Who. So, you know, the big thing there is that the BBC deleted quite a lot of their early Doctor Who. And bits and bobs of that have been found. And I wonder if there's actually anything that's completely lost on Red Dwarf. I'm not aware of anything but there could be stuff that's completely lost about Red Dwarf. Whereas the only thing that's really hurt is that Chucky thing, because I'm a massive fan of Chucky.
I mean, it's this could have easily been a lost thing had someone not put this up on YouTube. As I said, I'm not from the Seattle area, so I'd never seen this before. This is the first new Red Dwarf I've watched in a long time. I mean, it is what it is, and we'll talk more about how it's very much a product of its time. But
fuck yes.
But it's amazing. But had nobody, dug up their old VHS tapes, digitized them, and put them on, this would have been just another thing that would have been just a faint memory for the people involved, but no other way of accessing it.
And I don't think literally anything that is filmed from maybe the last 10 years is truly lost.
No.
Surely everyone's got access to almost anything, obviously paid access, but there are so many things that are just completely lost, and I think that's really sad. So let's have a look at this.
Yeah.
My first note wasn't very subtle. Yikes, smoking to start. And a lot of the things we talk about on this podcast is about how, because we're watching stuff that is 20, 30, 35 years old, there's stuff on it that you just simply wouldn't get away with on telly. And the very first thing is a British guy blowing smoke into the camera. I mean, fuck you now.
I mean, what a way to start it. Yeah.
Yeah, as we'll get to, this is chock full of 90s.
Oh, my goodness.
It really is.
So much. I wrote so many notes about how 90s it was. I love how they started it, though. I love how they were just, how instead of having them in the studio audience, they were just going around buying hot dogs. I just thought that was a great way to start it. The interaction, clearly they'd been given some money to go out and buy some food because they didn't know how much anything cost or whatever. And they're just like, let's have some hot dogs and some lemonades. And I can't be the only one thinking that they might have been surprised when the lemonade wasn't carbonated.
Yeah, American lemonade is nice, but it isn't lemonade. I don't know what the fuck it is, but it isn't lemonade. And I did a little bit of, I do this, and I shouldn't do this because it's just fucking depressing. They paid $10 for their hot dog.
Yeah.
Which they said at the time was £7.
Yeah.
It's £8.40 now, which says a lot about Brexit. Ooh, a little bit of politics. But it really winds me the fuck up.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't have to queue up for an hour, did they?
True. But £8.40 for a hot dog sounds really fucking expensive.
Well, it was 2 hot dogs and 2 lemonades.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's really cheap.
Yeah, I was thinking, wow, I mean, I'm sure it's more expensive now. This is what, 97? Oh, we should date this too. Was it 90? Yeah, 97.
Yeah.
97.
That's right. It'd probably be double the price now.
So that means Series 7 had gone out in the UK by that point, but it was still being transmitted in the States.
Right.
I believe they released it in 2 chunks when it came out. Like the PBS stations got half of it, and then later on they got the other half of it.
I wonder why they made that decision.
maybe to bring up to make it more of an event. They would show them all in one night. They would do it, and maybe they felt that Series 7 was 8 episodes, right?
Yes.
So maybe that would have just
been
maybe that would have been too much. Like, you want to start it at prime time, so doing 4 hours. People are going to set their VCRs to tape it, but nobody's going to watch the whole pledge drive. But the idea is to get people pledging. So
did they always do that, where they would play a big chunk of episodes rather than screen it episodically like it was done over here?
Well, they did show an episode every week regularly, but then when they were having one of their events or one of their pledge drives, then they'd do it like marathon style.
Yeah, and I think in Seattle they didn't actually show it weekly. There was a different Canadian television show that did, but I think Seattle PBS exclusively showed Red Dwarf during marathons. In terms of releasing it in 2 chunks, I seem to remember the last time I recorded, I did some obscure research, and the San Jose PBS in California received all the the series 7 or 8, I can't remember which one, all the episodes in one big chunk and aired them all in one big chunk. And apparently the last few episodes were aired in the USA on the Seattle station prior to airing on the BBC in the UK.
Oh, that's really interesting.
It's possible they would have part 1 and part 2 of the series just to ensure that the BBC was showing it first. I'm not really sure. That's just speculation on my part, but...
Makes sense, though. So the one thing that I noticed, again, very early on, this was 1997, like we said.
Yeah.
Robert's kid was 2. That child is now 27.
Oh, my. No, don't. Oh, my goodness.
Red Dwarf 35, that's all I'll say.
Oh, my goodness.
I know, right? We're actually recording this just a few days after Red Dwarf's 35th anniversary, and I don't know about you, but that made me feel fucking old.
Only if you acknowledge that it's true, which I haven't, so.
And I have this little thing in my head saying, well, I didn't actually start watching in 1988, so I can't be that old.
Yeah, true. I didn't either.
That's true. I started maybe 92, 91, 92, something like that. So I think I mentioned in the last podcast, but I started in series 4, and then I was watching it weekly each one, and then I watched Back to Reality, and then the next episode I watched was The End, and I was so confused. I was just so confused because the way Back to Reality ended, it kind of looked, and so I thought, the episode called The End, I'm like, oh my goodness, Red Dwarf is ending. I didn't. Again, pre-internet days, where it was just listings, and I watched and I'm like, are they, blew my mind. And then I watched it all through again. But I think that's one of the great things about watching it in the States is they reran the early episodes just as much as the later ones.
Oh yeah, like I'm more familiar with Red Dwarf Series 1 than any of the series.
Oh yeah, easily.
I think it's 5 and 6 for me, just because they were the ones I enjoyed the most, and most of my access was via VHS. So I think it's genuinely, from that time, it's mainly due to access what you're most familiar to. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so.
Because I became a real fan around the time I was doing the rewatch of Series 1 and 2, so I taped those, and before I was just watching it when it was on. But I taped those and I watched them 1,000 times. I don't even need to watch Red Dwarf anymore because I can just play it back all in my head, Yeah. Actually, I mean, we'll talk about this later, but during points where they're asking the cast is quoting Red Dwarf quotes, I'm like, nah, you messed that one up. That's not it.
Yes.
They would defer to the fans constantly because they're in and out of episodes in terms of filming. They're not the nerds like we are.
Oh my goodness.
And I think that's kind of the same with any fandom.
Oh, yeah.
Fans seem to expect people to be able to quote one line that they read 20 years ago. And it's like, no, they're not going to be able to do that. They're not as much. Bizarrely, even when you're in something, you're not as big a fan as the majority of the people that you will see at a convention.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, they're basically just regurgitating the lines, forgetting it, and then ramming the next few episodes into their head. So it makes sense that they forget a lot of the content.
Of course. I got to say, one thing I just absolutely adored about this video was just the amazing chemistry between Robert and Craig. They just looked like they were having so much fun.
Yeah, especially considering that it was usually Craig and Danny who would go out clubbing and hanging out during the early first series. So it seemed like there was a very good bond built up over time between Craig and Robert. Yeah,
definitely. One thing that I put in my notes was how it was interesting that they were talking about how the series didn't really get any like critical, it didn't really hit its stride until series 3. In the UK, and how series 1 and 2 were just these tiny little niche things or whatever, and that it was getting more critical acclaim in the US before it actually got any awards in the UK. That surprised me. I didn't know that.
I don't know. To me, it seems like it makes sense that the BBC looked down on it. They clearly didn't want it to be as successful as it was, and
they seem to do that a lot.
I can understand why.
The BBC is infamous for hating sci-fi, aren't they?
Oh yeah,
exactly right.
What was it, Michael Grade or whatever, who like tried to sabotage Doctor Who to keep it from being a success because he personally didn't like it. So just weird. And I mean, Red Dwarf only got the pass because it called itself a sitcom rather than a sci-fi series.
They mentioned this, that the show did so much better than anyone expected it to do.
Yeah.
And it was like BBC Two's top-rated show at one point, despite the fact they didn't fucking want it to be. And I kind of like that. It's the little show that could. And who would have thought that on the 35th anniversary, after another fucking public fallout, there was talk of the writers getting back together to do more Red Dwarf. It's fucking great, and it is undefeatable.
Oh, yeah.
This little show.
Oh, I keep thinking it's over. It's like, you know what? That was a good run, but that's all the Red Dwarf we're going to get. And suddenly they're like, oh, no, we're making some more.
Yeah, that announcement, the joint announcement from Grant and Naylor was surprising considering the active lawsuit going on over the Red Dwarf IP.
I mean, I went into researching it a little more after we had the podcast last time. I got kind of back into it, gave the whole series a rewatch, and and I was reading that, and I'm like, oh, wow, it's pretty toxic. It seems like we're done now, and yeah, this show cannot be stopped.
Yeah, either done or it would only continue after an acrimonious end to the lawsuit. But even though it's not over yet, they seem to be kissy-kissy, so that's a good sign.
I think so, and I'm really pleased because those kind of lawsuits, even in the UK, they're worse in the States, I think, but even in the UK, they can last forever.
Oh, yeah.
And just ruin something with time, let alone with grottiness, you know?
Yeah.
Lawsuit stasis.
Yeah, exactly that. Now, did you know, I probably should have known this, but originally the Lister part wasn't designed to be mixed race.
I had heard that before, but I was surprised that apparently Craig was brought on as like a racial consultant.
Yes.
And then he was like, hey, can I be this for the cat? It's like, the cat, we're thinking of making the cat like this. Is this racist? And while he was there, he's like, can I audition for Lister?
But I always thought that the diversity was really important on Red Dwarf. There was never really any women. But I remember when they were talking about Red Dwarf US, that Craig Charles explicitly said they made it White Dwarf.
Yeah.
Craig was a beat poet prior to Red Dwarf. That's how...
If you didn't know that, you fucking knew it by the end of watching these specials, damn it.
Goodness. Oh, yeah. If there's one thing they really wanted to beat into your head, it's like he started off as a poet. Yeah.
Yeah. Paul Jackson specifically spoke to Craig Charles about looking at this cat character to see if it was racist because specifically a lot of the he didn't necessarily come out in these specials, but a lot of the poetry that Craig Charles did was very angst-ridden, and it was about social justice, and it was about inequality and how it affected Black people in the UK and stuff like that. I don't think that fully came out in these specials, but it was because of that role that Craig Charles had a very prominent name in the UK for Black social justice, and Paul Jackson must have known him because they're both on TV quite a bit, and it was just made to be, I suppose, this consultancy role.
Before we go too far, now I have a basic question about this special. Now, Swirly Thing Alert is obviously clips from a larger thing, right? Was this released as like a VHS tape or something? Because it looks like this is more of a compilation because they've edited out the parts where they had station breaks because this would have been part of like a Red Dwarf night, like a pledge drive, right?
Yeah, the studio parts were part of a marathon or a telethon or whatever you want to call it, a pledge drive. So yeah, and then there would be when the cast members would come over, they would take part in the marathon, but they would also attend a convention because it was this big promotional tour they were on. So I think the Seattle PBS made these into VHS tapes, and my guess would be that in the subsequent marathon, they would make this the top gift.
That's what I was thinking, that it was something, that it was a compilation, because and Mark, just in case you didn't know, why maybe it looked like it didn't flow super well is because there would have been episodes stuffed in between these bits.
Okay, that makes sense.
The studio segments, yeah.
Yeah, especially the second one, which we'll talk about later, it's kind of like best clips of probably what was a much, much longer thing.
Yeah, and there were very few clips from the in this episode, Swirly Thing Alert. There were very few studio clips of Craig and Robert. I was kind of surprised. I guess there's a lot of content, and the whole thing ran about almost 2 hours, but very little pledge drive clips.
So when you were talking about lost media, that's something I'd like to track down, because they were definitely just using little bits and pieces of longer interviews and things like that. So I would love to find the raw video. Like I wonder if it exists.
I don't think there's enough time in the world to watch the raw video.
But in terms of whether it exists, I've seen some of those on the Internet Archive.
Okay.
In fact, some of the little video clips that I made for Mark for posting on Twitter during our last episode actually came from the videos I downloaded from the Internet Archive.
Oh, that's great. If I ever get back to the States, I'm going to try to find some of the old pledge drive videos I taped and see if there's some bits that never made it onto the internet. But if I can find, I do not know how well those tapes have been preserved. They're probably in my parents' basement right now. So
yeah, they're either going to be in pristine condition or unaccessible, aren't they? So, yeah. So I want to talk about the references to Red Dwarf: The Next Generation and lots of Star Trek stuff.
Yeah.
They were like saying how, I think we're only going to finish and then we're going to do films. Yeah. And I don't know how long it'll last. And maybe there will be a Red Dwarf. No, that's not what happened.
It was so funny. I wrote that as well. The quote was, well, how long can it go on? Craig said, and he said, Series 8 will be the last series, but movies after that.
Definitely the last series. But it was interesting how they went into detail. Sorry if I'm jumping ahead, but
no, go ahead.
It was interesting how they mentioned that there was already a fairly hefty sized chunk of money already raised for that initial movie, and that apparently the studio was already booked.
Yeah. They said, studio already booked, and they knew bits of the plot because they weren't letting it out. They were kind of keeping their cards close. So script must have been written at that point if studio time was booked. I don't know. I
think there was a reference to a script. And it was interesting. They also said that the movie would be combined with a live stage show.
Yes, that I never heard that before. Yeah.
I would have gone to see that. Fucking hell. I would have loved that.
I guess Danny John Jules has the in there.
That makes sense.
Well, yeah.
But it's sad that it never happened. But we did eventually get a film, which I've not been allowed to watch.
You're doing it chronologically, aren't you? Yes.
Yeah, and so we're trying to have it as like a fresh perspective with me watching the newer stuff. Mm-hmm. But since doing the podcast, we've been doing it 2.5 years now, and I want to watch the new stuff. And Kurt's never available to do the main episodes. It's why we do so many fucking specials.
Well, I was going to blame you for doing so many bloody specials, but I guess it's the other way around.
It's because I'm bored. I'm bored, and Kurt's not available. That's why. And he'll hate me for revealing the truth. I'd love to apologise, but if I did, I wouldn't mean it.
No, that's fine. When you do the specials, then we get involved. So
true, but it's going to take me a long time to get to see the eventual movie that should have happened in the year 2000 maybe, but it was more like 2020. Was it 2020 that they did?
2020, yeah. Oh, this could be a good thing because by the time you get to it, you could be like, "Well, I'm finally getting to watch the first Red Dwarf movie." So.
In time for Red Dwarf 45.
And then, did find interesting, talking about specials,
Yeah.
is I've added a couple of new specials to our list from this, because I'd heard of Thin He Was and Filthy Haired, I'd heard of The Man in the Rubber Mask, and I'd heard of The Reconstructed Heart. I hadn't heard of Therapy and How to Avoid It, a book by Robert Llewellyn. So I'm going to try and get a copy of that and read that. And also I had no idea about No Other Blue, which was Craig Charles's poetry anthology. And I think they would actually genuinely be very interesting things to take a look at.
Have you already done Craig Charles Live on Earth?
No, but it's on the list.
You've already seen half of it because he kept quoting it this whole special.
Really?
Anything that was funny, like that wasn't a Red Dwarf quote, was a quote from his stand-up. Like there were so many. Most of the poems that he read were from that stand-up special. He would be asked a question, then he would move into like doing a bit. So many of them were either from Craig Charles Live on Earth or from his second stand-up special. What was it called? Sick Bag or something like that. I don't remember.
Yeah, it was called Sick Bag. But it's interesting, isn't it? At the time, you could have absolutely got away with that.
Yeah. Oh,
he
completely.
knew it was only being published in Seattle.
Yeah.
So therefore, he could rehash all his material rather than writing new stuff.
Yep. And Craig Charles Live on Earth, I mean, I'd seen as a bootleg, but it has still never received an official release. You can watch it on YouTube now, but like at that time, there was no way to see it unless you were like one of the diehard fans, which meant you were probably in Seattle watching it anyway. So.
That is almost a culture that's completely gone now. Is that I think it's tougher for stand-up comics to keep creating new stuff when they never really used to need to do that.
No.
Yeah, with the internet now, you can't really hide any content. I mean, I'm hearing North Americans use the term full stop, not grammatically, but just to emphasize a point. And I don't think they even realize full stop means what in North America is called a period, a grammatical, the end of the sentence. That just goes to show you the power of the internet now. So there's absolutely no way of hiding content between continents these days.
Oh, no.
No.
When he was being asked questions, like he's being talked about, like missing a flight over and having a strip search or whatever, that it was like verbatim. It's a verbatim from his stand-up special about talking about when he was first put in jail. So his stories, it's like, okay, they're funny stories, but like he's regurgitating large chunks of his stand-up, which is funny. It's a very funny stand-up special, but I'm listening to it and I'm like, I have heard this story, but in a different context.
Fascinating. I think I probably did see his stand-up at the time, but I haven't seen it in years. And I wonder how much, having watched these, it'll ruin it. I don't think it will. But I think the regurgitating gags thing, it kind of adds to how cheap yet strangely charming the whole experience of watching this special was for me.
Oh my goodness. That one poem, he used it so many times. And it worked every single time. It worked every single time.
So do we want to talk about his creepy poem and how fucking creepy Craig Charles really was during the whole thing?
Oh my goodness. Oh, yeah.
I'll save my worst comments on that for the next special.
It wasn't just how creepy he was with the women. I thought he was genuinely quite mean and rude to a bigger guy and a bald guy with no provocation.
No.
But I also think he was encouraged to do so. A randy woman sat on his lap at one point, and I'm like, fuck.
Oh my, if you wanted to describe the live audiences on these specials in 2 words, it would be awkward and horny. Like, it's just like,
yes,
they were so awkward and so horny.
My notes, I wrote down, Craig Charles is actually super creepy. And I then put ... so is Robert, ... so are the audience. Fucking 90s, man.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
I don't think Americans would have done a lot of the kissy, but I think because these are Brits, it's just assumed, they're European.
Yeah, that story that Robert told about needing to have a 5-minute stare at the Kachansky's bottom. I was just like, And he was telling it and everyone was laughing. It's like, oh, that's funny. He's like, I'm a married man, but she's a very attractive woman. So I said, can I look at your butt for 5 minutes? And just like, that's a story I hadn't heard before because any new media would have deleted that story.
Oh, fuck yes. Yeah, the whole thing just smacked of 90s. It's okay to be a bit creepy.
Yeah.
And I looked up why. Because someone mentioned this, that Craig Charles had been the wanker of the week on The Girly Show.
Yeah.
Now, I remember watching The Girly Show, and I tried desperately to find out why he'd earned that. And I could only find the Jeremy Clarkson. And I mean, Jeremy Clarkson is one of the worst human beings in the entire world. And he very much deserved wanker of the week. But I just wonder whether Craig Charles did. But having watched this, yeah, you probably did, mate.
Yeah.
Oh, going back to Robert supposedly staring at Chloe Annette's butt, I remember Chloe Annette doing an interview in some small obscure PBS, I think it was in Iowa or something, and she made it very clear that it was a very blokey cast and very blokey crew.
Oh, yeah.
After listening to that comment from Robert, yeah, I can definitely see why.
I don't know, in subsequent interviews of things, he always seemed to be the adult in the room.
Yes.
So I was like, the audience was so awkward though. And they were eating it up though. They loved all that stuff.
So I do have some experience as the host doing the Joel McHale or the George, whatever his name was. And I'll be honest, big kind of obsessive fandoms, they're all a little bit like this.
Oh, yeah.
I've done wrestling Q&As with quite famous wrestlers, I've done with Razor Ramon, I've done with the Honky Tonk Man and a couple of others. And the audiences there were all very, very similar to this. And this was only 3 or 4 years ago, not 1997. So it was fascinating to me to see how, okay, maybe the venues are a bit nicer. Maybe there are a few more production values on these sort of things. But the audiences haven't really changed.
No. I suppose, especially when you have something that is not considered mainstream, especially in the United States, if you'd had to have been introduced to Red Dwarf, you're not going to accidentally find it. It wasn't that popular. But among those who watched it, you had like any small niche fandom or whatever, people get really into it. Did you see in the video how many handmade things there were?
There were. And yeah, that still happens.
And how many weird gifts were being given to them?
Again, that still happens.
I want you to have this umbrella hat.
Which have no relevance to Red Dwarf whatsoever.
Have you ever seen Red Dwarf? Did you?
Hey, she's a hustler. She's getting her gear in there.
Yeah.
I don't know. The thing about homemade stuff, it was so crude here, whereas, cosplay is a huge culture in the entire world now. So it's much more sophisticated, but it doesn't feel like it's just an ever so slightly more sophisticated version with modern fandom and conventions and that sort of thing. And again, that was so fascinating for me to watch as someone who's gently dipped my toe in being on the other side of that.
Sure.
It was like, fucking hell. This is what I would have had to have dealt with in the 90s.
Oh, man.
The couple in the gingham dresses, that was pretty funny.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I enjoyed that. One of the things that was really interesting was obviously we're going to talk later about how much repetition was in this video because everybody's asking the same questions. But some of the questions were so, you couldn't really exist except in a time before easy internet access. You know what I mean? Because some of them were so, all it would take is a very quick search, and you wouldn't even ask that. You'd still, at these, they still have Comic-Con, they still have things, and people are asking some more obscure questions, or what was it really like behind the scenes, or, but I mean, they were asking just plot things from episodes, or what are the lyrics in the theme tune? And, it's just and I found it charming. It was actually charming. And I loved that the cast didn't get so angry at being asked the same question for the fifth time within this special. They were asked it. I can't imagine how many times they've had to deal with it in their lives.
It feels like you needed a little more patience in the 90s.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of the questions were probably more appropriate for the writers rather than the actors. But these people didn't care. Let's just ask questions about Red Dwarf because there's someone related to Red Dwarf in front of me.
Yeah.
And I thought they actually did genuinely quite well.
Oh, I thought so.
But finding a way to answer questions that simply shouldn't have been asked to them.
Yeah, a lot of continuity questions and things like that. There's no way the cast members would have known. As you mentioned, Mark, it's probably a lot better for the writers to answer, but they obviously weren't there.
Yeah, and I mean, not everyone can ask to sit on their laps or things like that. They have to. Well, my other one was that younger girl. She was like, I know a lot of people have come up and asked to sit in your lap or asked for a kiss, and I'm not going to do that. I'm like, good for you. And she's like, but in the future, can you be nude? It's just like it's so awkward. It's just so.
And it was her that made me add, and so are the audience.
Yeah,
for my everything is creepy.
It was a hornier time, Mark.
Oh, people are still horny. I've got Grindr. We just know how to behave. Fuck.
What was it like when Craig Charles was like, oh, the girl wearing the, what was it, Hello Boys t-shirt? Was that it? Or whatever.
Oh,
and Craig Charles makes, and he says, oh, and that's what I like to see. Cleavage you can ski down or something like that, which is a line from Red Dwarf. It is, but it just felt so much worse when it was applied to a living person, just.
And I think there's always a weird kind of amalgam of the person and their character when it comes to conventions. It was almost like it was Craig Lister or Dave Charles,
Yeah.
He had to slide in and out of, I suppose I'm going to use a term from wrestling because that's what I know, kayfabe. And people do that still. They talk about how they might be their real name, and then they talk about how they might be their wrestler's name, and they do slide in and out in these Q&As. And it's a fascinating, weird little culture that only really happens at this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed that when questions were posed to the crew members, or the cast members, I should say, they were often asked in the name of the character, not in the name of the actor, even though they were specifically posed to the actors. So some people might have had difficulty breaking the kayfabe, as you can say.
Mm.
Oh, I would say.
And I thought it was fascinating, absolutely fascinating, that Americans who consider the British to be very, very polite exclusively referred to them as Mr. Charles and Mr. Llewellyn.
Yep.
Absolutely fascinating. We are not that fucking polite, and we fucking swear more than you lot do. And the stereotype is not only wrong, but almost a hypocrisy from you lot because you're so fucking polite.
Well, there was so much British television, at least in Canada, I assume in the US as well, on some stations, but there was so much British television in the 90s in Canada. And most of it was showing, the upper classes and...
Yep. Upstairs, downstairs.
Yeah.
Fair.
You didn't have a lot of, what's the Peckham comedy? The two swindlers selling
Only
things.
Fools and Horses.
Yeah, you didn't have a lot of stuff like that on Canadian television. So the image of British people was all very genteel and upper class.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. But it's weird that even though the world has got smaller, because this really does show us how the world has got smaller.
Oh, yeah.
And we still have that incredibly outdated stereotype about British people. The one about teeth, maybe there's something to it. But the politeness, just no. It's just not fucking true.
Yeah, it would take about one day in London for Americans to realize that it's mostly fiction.
I enjoyed, and maybe this is just a reminiscence from the 90s, but I enjoyed how much the visiting cast members enjoyed being in America, and we're talking about I just enjoy America being portrayed in a positive light because it's been so long. I don't know. Maybe it's just, I haven't lived in America for a long time. Maybe if I still lived there, I'd have a different idea. But like a lot of the time when I hear about my home country, it's not good news. You know what I mean? So seeing them like enjoy that little festival and kind of interact with these fans and talk about it was so nice. And it was 97. It was before, I don't know, or maybe I was too young to know, but you know, it was a simpler time.
Yeah, and specifically Seattle has it can be an edgy city, but I think
Sure.
for the most part it's a pretty soft place, shall we say, culturally. So they were inserted into a friendly part of the country.
Yeah. And they refer during one part to a convention in Chicago where they had thousands of people come. He's telling the story about a woman who waited in line for 4 hours for his autograph and then fainted when she arrived.
Which is adorable.
That was definitely Visions in Chicago. That's a convention that I went to. Not that year, but it was actually that year's, the stories of Red Dwarf cast that made me want to come the next year. Because apparently Craig Charles got in trouble for swimming in the fountain in the hotel lobby. Like, got really drunk and like was kind of like told he couldn't come to that convention anymore or something like that. So instead they invited Chris Berry the next year. And that's the year that I went. But unfortunately, that was also the year he got married. So he canceled at last moment. So there were no Red Dwarf stars there that year. But yeah, that convention was probably the largest one in the Midwest. And that's where people who would have seen these people, yeah, Craig Charles had been there. Danny John Jules had been there 1 year. Hattie'd been there. Maybe that's it. But yeah, doesn't exist anymore. But it was a pretty large scale. It was a science fiction convention that didn't do any of the main fandoms. It was billed itself as the unconventional television convention. So it would be focusing on the like more obscure things, a lot of British sci-fi, like Doctor Who, Red Dwarf, but also like less well-known things like the short-lived comedy sci-fi called Quark, if you've ever heard of that. It was produced by the same people who did Get Smart.
I've not seen it.
It might be interesting because I would be surprised if it wasn't a little bit of an inspiration for Red Dwarf, because it dealt with it was set in space, but it dealt with like people who I believe were sanitation workers.
Okay,
so
that does sound a bit.
It's very like, it's not the captain and it's the menial staff. That was the idea, but maybe not, because I don't know if it even hit the UK, but it was short-lived little thing.
Sounds like Red Dwarf Series 1.
Very much, yeah. I mean, what was the inspiration that the writers said in the DVD commentary? Definitely Dark Star, of kind of like the monotony of being alone in deep space and things like that. But yeah.
So I want to tease out some facts that we learnt that, for me, I've got a couple of things that I've noted down that I thought were genuinely interesting that I didn't know about. And first of all was a couple of what inspired Robert Llewellyn with the way he played Crichton. Herman Munster and Lloyd Grossman.
Yeah.
Do you two know who Lloyd Grossman is?
Only from this special.
Right, okay. So I'm going to do a terrible impression of Lloyd Grossman that literally every British person will get. And almost every British person can do a reasonably good Lloyd Grossman impression. Who would live in a house like this? For all the Brits, they would recognise it and they can do that. But it's fascinating that neither of you know who Lloyd Grossman is.
He's an American?
Yes. He presented MasterChef, which was a cookery...
Oh, okay. I know MasterChef, yeah.
Okay, he presented British MasterChef for years. And he also presented Through the Keyhole, where you would go to a celebrity's house, have a little tour, and then the panel had to guess whose house it was.
Huh.
And he had these catchphrases on both of those shows that everyone in Britain of a certain age did and can still do a pretty good impression of Lloyd. And it's the fact that it was referenced on this to an audience that wouldn't know who the fuck he was, particularly in the 90s.
No idea. But I mean, that's like it. Especially what's interesting is like people from other countries who make it big in a different country. We talked about what did we talk about? Mac McDonald last time.
Exactly.
who no American knows of, other than maybe he was the guy in The Fifth Element.
I was about to say Fifth Element. He was the cop in the car, wasn't
Yeah, but other than that, there's people in Japan like that too. There's foreigners who made a career here being Americans in Japan. You know, they're on television or whatever. There's one comedian who has this catchphrase that goes, "Why Japanese people?" That's his catchphrase, and I don't find him very funny at all. But like, he's hugely popular here, and Japanese people all know him, but no American would know of him other than if you live here. So very interesting.
That reminds me of a Canadian stand-up comic. Her name slips me, but when I was in the UK between mid-2000s, let's say, she was just making her name over there in the UK, and she was on quite a few shows, actually. And then I came back to Canada, and she must have come back around the same time, and I saw her on CBC shows. I was thinking, what the hell is going on here? But yeah, she made a name for herself over there, but she was one of the few, I guess, who came back to her original country. Had to start from scratch.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, so neither of you know who Lloyd Grossman is, but Herman Munster, you both know.
Of course.
Must it, surely?
Mm-hmm.
And I'd never thought about it until he said it, and now I'm like, fucking hell, it's basically a Herman Munster impression with a Lloyd Grossman voice.
Yeah.
It's flabbergasting how simple it was, really.
Yeah. Well, it's such a weird amalgamation because not only is there Lloyd Grossman Boston drawl, which is unique to Lloyd Grossman, but he says it's overall, Robert Llewellyn says the Crichton accent is from Vancouver.
Yeah.
Which is where I'm from.
Yeah.
You don't sound like Crichton.
It's all a lie.
Oh, you're not Crichton? I thought that's why you were on this cast. Oh, okay. Well.
Sorry, gentlemen.
This is how we sound in Vancouver.
But yeah, it is such a weird amalgamation, just like the cat character, I suppose.
Yeah, which they discuss in the next special. We'll look at that at another point, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything else that you two particularly picked out as like, fuck, that's cool from this special?
Oh, how long of a list do you want here?
Go for it.
You have talked about how it was awkward that in Series 7 there was no studio audience and the pros and cons of that. It was interesting to hear Craig Charles talk very excitedly the fact that there was no studio audience for Series 7. So I think it was a bit distracting for the cast members having to play to the camera, but also having to play to the studio audience. And in this series, in Series 7, they were able to focus just on the cameras, which makes sense. But obviously, there's downsides. Like, it feels quite jarring when there's no laughter and whatnot. Craig Charles mentioned he was proud to perform his own stunts, which was interesting.
Yeah.
There weren't a lot of things that you would expect would require a stunt double, but it was interesting to see that they've never used a stunt double for Craig before.
I think there were a lot of interesting little tidbits that are quite poignant with hindsight, actually. Stuff like they were pleased there was no studio audience, but that was one of the biggest criticisms of Series 7 was that it felt soulless for that same reason. Yeah. There was quite a few bits and bobs like that, the film that never happened, etc., where it was like, damn, they had all these things that this is definitely fascinating to watch with hindsight, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they really did think films was going to be the way that it was going to go, and which is still what they think these days.
That's where the big money is, I suppose. And that's ultimately why Series 7 and 8 had 8 episodes rather than 6, as they were gunning for selling the syndication and then, I suppose, dumping the television and moving straight to movies.
Yeah. Yeah, just really interesting. I mean, since I've watched so many interviews and things like that, there weren't many like brand new stories that I heard, but some of it with the context, like when they were talking about fans' reaction to the CG elements being added rather than using the model shots that people were most like, they seemed so excited about that technology at the time. They were saying, like, you know, the Red Dwarf was moving ahead with the technology. You know, that's interesting because, like, what's fun is, like, on later commentaries, the same cast, when asked those questions, kind of admit that it looked kind of cheesy, but like it was probably somewhat cutting edge at the time. But like their own thoughts can change. Also, I didn't realize that Series 7. I thought the official line was that Chris Berry left for half of the season because he wanted to be ridden out of the series. I didn't know it was just a scheduling conflict. Or is that also apocryphal?
I don't know. The first I heard about this was watching this for this special.
Yeah.
I just was under the impression that it was to do with the fact that he had too many commitments for Britas.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that he was like, write me out, but bring me back. But I'm glad that he was in a way, because it's. I think Series 8 does benefit from having him back.
Oh, it does. But then it kind of seems like they spent 2 episodes of having him leave, and the whole thing with Blue of bringing him back. It kind of depletes that. But like, again, I've watched DVD specials before, and it sounded like he was getting like burned out on Red Dwarf. But then when he had some time away from it, he wanted to be part of it again. But again, these are contemporary things. The other one is when they're talking about the question with, Rob Grant and Doug Nyler. And it's weird because they're like, I think they're still friends. And then later he's like, it's kind of like being in a divorce. I'm like, so which one is it? Kind of like maybe they don't know exactly what to say about that whole thing.
Yeah, that's probably fair.
And it was the first time I'd seen them refer to Grant Naylor as the comedy police and kind of mock their Manchester accent and say, yes, no.
Yeah.
Obviously wasn't in a Manchester accent. But
the only other thing that I really noticed that I wanted to mention very briefly is that Craig Charles really did seem to believe in Captain Butler.
Yeah.
And it's shit.
I've never seen it. And like...
Don't. It's cack.
He won't need this Red Dwarf business anymore. He's got Captain Butler.
Fucking Captain Butler.
He brought it up so many times.
and it was so bad.
I won't spoil it, but in our next episode, we'll talk about his thoughts on Captain Butler 1 year later.
All right.
One other thing I wanted to add in terms of the little curios and the information that we learned was the double Polaroid prank.
Yeah, I wrote that. Apparently it was real private parts.
Do you recall the episode that was in?
That would have been in DNA.
Right.
Yes, when Crichton became a human.
Right,
I think it's fascinating that this is so obscure that something like that hasn't been picked up on. I don't know if you've heard about what happened with John Barrowman on the sets of Doctor Who and why he's no longer involved in Doctor Who anymore.
Yeah.
For a joke, he used to get his cock out quite a lot. And he still maintains it was all in good fun, all jests, blah, blah, blah. But he is not used for that reason. And you've got to think that whoever did that to Craig Charles, particularly if he was doing stuff like that to Chloe Annett, would have had the same kind of fucking fate as John Barrowman.
Oh, yeah. He would have been canceled immediately. Like, I don't mean to use that word in a pejorative because, like, sometimes things, that's the course of progress, but like, it's hard to watch it without thinking of a modern context. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely cringy when you think about it today, but I think at the time it would have been amusing, especially if Chloe wasn't subjected to that. If you were using these blank Polaroids during all of your rehearsals and suddenly during the live filming, you pull that out, that would be jarring.
Well, I mean, that makes the reaction, I want to rewatch that now because apparently, that the reaction is of genuine surprise.
That it was a real cock.
Yeah.
So the only other thing I really wanted to briefly touch on was Joel McHale is really famous now, and he was second string to a bloke called George with a great ash.
Yes.
So George Ray was the perennial host of this channel, KTCS9 in Seattle. So he would appear on every single British comedy marathon, whether it's Red Dwarf, Blackadder, Fawlty Towers, you name it. He'd be the face, and he would appear in quite a few television shows, and he'd appear in ads.
He seems to know the material.
Yes, absolutely.
He did, actually.
Yeah, he definitely did watch it. So he would appear pretty much on everything, but then they would have usually a second person help out during many of these telethons in the studio. So at the very beginning, the very first clip, it was less than a minute, I think. There was George Ray, and there was a woman named Nancy Guppy, and she's actually a locally famous comedian in Seattle on a show called Almost Live.
Oh.
So Saturday Night Live is a really popular show on NBC that would air at 11:30. It would go about an hour and a half to 1 a.m. But everywhere in the US it would show at 11:30, except in Seattle, where there was a half-hour show that pushed Saturday Night Live back to midnight. So this half-hour show ran from 11:30 to midnight. It was called Almost Live, and it was a locally made Seattle comedy that would run skits kind of making fun of itself. It was very self-deprecating, and sometimes cast members from that would come on and help out. So the woman we saw in the very first studio segment was Nancy Guppy. She would show up again in the second studio clip, but there was also Joel McHale, as you said. He only had a couple of lines in the whole thing, which is kind of funny because he's so famous now. But as he said, he appeared in a bunch of shows. Community was probably the most famous. It ran from 2009 to 2014 on NBC. I've never actually seen it.
What? Oh, you should. You really should. It's really good.
Community's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It is a lot of fun. It's worth watching.
Okay. But yeah, he went from appearing in these little clips on PBS in the early 90s saying, please donate now to community television. It's viewers like you who help us out. Going from that to being the main star on a NBC sitcom was interesting.
Yeah. So, gents, it's been a lot of fun having you on board for another one of these international chats.
Well, it's been a pleasure to come on.
I enjoy it every time.
So, Kevin, where can people find you on the internet?
Oh, they can find me at famicomdojo.com if they're interested in video game stuff, primarily Japanese retro games. And if you want to hear me continue to talk about television, we did an episode recently on the first two series of Red Dwarf, and then Doctor Who and things like that. Go and search for Two Boobs Watch the Tube. Be careful when you're searching for that on the internet. You don't want to abbreviate that. Or maybe you do. And you know what? If you appreciate that content, that's great too. But you're probably not going to find me if you shorten that at all. But Two Boobs Watch the Tube.
Safe search, kids. Safe search.
Safe search, yes.
And Devon, what about you?
I work as a writer. I write about both politics and football. So if you're interested in the politics, the accounts, primarily Twitter, it's Devon Rowcliffe. And if you're interested in football, it's Who Ate the Squid. I actually have a book out in the UK with Pitch Publishing called Who Ate All the Squid Football Adventures in South Korea, which is about a Scottish football manager who goes out to manage a struggling team in South Korea.
Amazing. Thank you both for joining me. And you're coming back next week to talk about the following year's PBS special.
Just try and stop me.
I know, right? And that was called Smegheads in Seattle. Yes. So that's next week.
Well,
but until then...
Mark's not paying us until we come back and finish the second episode. So
yeah,
I'm not paying you. Anyway, thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. And until then...
Yes. No.
Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast, was created and produced by Mark Adams and Kurt North. You can find us on Twitter at Red Dwarf Pod, and we are part of the We Made This Podcast network, which can be found online at wemadethispod.com or on Twitter at wemadethispod.
Hello, and this is Chucky Vision on the We Made This Network, the podcast for all things Chucky. I'm Dev Elson.
And I'm Mark Adams. We're two queer podcasters who love bloody horror,
camp comedy, gay romance,
and referencing icons like Freddy, Jason, and Britney.
The Chucky films and new TV show deliver all of that, and there is still so much more to cover.
So if you want to play, find Chucky Vision on Twitter at Chucky Vision and on all good podcast providers.
And yes, the title is a Chuckle Vision pun.
Because why not?